All right, Jason. So we've seen 1956. We've seen our collection, your favorites. Now we were going to take a look at the winner's floor, but before we get there, I kind of want to just talk about the museum as it is and how it really has been since 1976. A few things are different. I think there was a fountain here at one point. And also these big pane glass windows, unfortunately, aren't going to make it through the restoration. I know maybe you don't feel quite the same way about those windows.
Yeah, obviously when this building was built in 1976, there was a actual water fountain here, decorative piece. It quickly they found out that it was not suitable for vehicles to be on display, so they capped it, and it was a bit of a podium for a while. And then in 2016, we removed it to allow us to do more events and things like that in this atrium. The skylight, yeah, it is a unique piece, but unfortunately, for collection-wise and light levels, it really harms things here. So we are capping that, and that's going to be an improvement for the collection on display.
And speaking of the collection, I mean, this is something that I think folks who are regulars within the museum almost look past. But looking at this room right here, the winner's floor, with new eyes, it's just unbelievable. And we've actually lost a couple of cars because of you guys moving out of the museum. But even looking at this right now, this is so impressive, this collection of Indy 500 winning cars. I mean, there's nothing else like it in the world. It's so valuable. It's such an amazing preservation job that you guys have done here.
Yeah, we have 34 winning cars in the collection, and a few that are on loan, and some have gone to other locations already as we get into our closing factor. But it truly is the largest collection of winning 500 cars on display to the public, and you know we're excited to kind of engineer this area for a pretty stunning display when we reopen.
Yeah, I've seen the renderings of it. I think I showed them in the first part of the video. It's really going to be impressive, and I'm really looking forward to it. And you know, we've talked about some of the pre-war cars, I guess we could say, in our previous video. But René Thomas in the Delage, as Paul Page loved to say. I mean, this is a beautiful racing machine, and the French really had a great influence on this race in the early years.
Yeah. So Carl Fischer's idea of the 500 itself was always this international take on it. The original name of the race was the International 500-Mile Sweepstakes. So the first 2 years you had some international, not factory-backed teams, but international car makes, if you will. But really in 1913 with the Peugeot team showing up and dominating the Delage the following year with Thomas. But you know, that was the car to have, Peugeot and somewhat the Delage in the early days of the 500.
And the Peugeot engine ultimately kind of begat the Offenhauser, which was the winningest, which still is the winningest engine in the Indianapolis 500. So some great names are the next couple of cars: Louis Meyer, Maury Rose. Those are kind of the equivalents of Joseph Newgarden or an Alex Palou of the current day. Tell us a little bit about these two cars.
Yeah, we talked about Leon Duret's front drive Miller, but this right here, Louis Meyer's rear drive 91.5 cubic inch. So Miller, the company, offered two configurations during this time, would go on to be the first of what became 3 victories for Louis Meyer. Obviously, his name is synonymous with the milk tradition that happened later. And then later on, another 3-time winner in a unique circumstance. Maury Rose in 1941, his first victory in the Wetteroth right here. You know, it's interesting because 24 and 41 are the 2 years that you have co-drivers, winning drivers, and this is the car here. And it was the first of multiple wins for car owner Lou Moore, who, before Roger came along, was the winningest car owner at that time. It started that success for him.
Yeah, and that knockout hose clamp special livery is just so beautiful. And that was a car that you guys let me sit in. You should let me do that more. Come on,
yeah,
Jason.
This car actually has a lot of NASCAR roots too, with Joey Chitwood and the Speedway series. And I know there's a lot of videos on that Speedway division of NASCAR in the early days, racing at Darlington and things like that, albeit with the Cadillac engine and not the Offenhauser.
That's something a lot of people don't know, is that that NASCAR did have an IndyCar equivalent series for quite a while. You know, we probably wouldn't even be saying the word IndyCar or the phrase IndyCar without the 1946 Indianapolis 500, and the significance of this particular race car, I don't think is overstated enough. you mentioned Wilbur Shaw, you mentioned Tony Holman, and just the importance of that 1946 race.
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, you think it's one of the best decisions ever, which it was for the duration and legacy of the Speedway. But really, both Shaw and Holman did not know what lay ahead. The work that they had to do over the winter months of 46 to get the track ready was a Herculean effort. And then the demand that they saw for that race. I believe the stories have it that there were some people that were stuck in traffic for so long they saw limited to no part of the race itself because of just the demand. But obviously George Robeson in this car going on to win with Art Sparks and Joe Thorne, the designer and the car owner. But what's unique about this car too, up until the current engine configuration, so pre-2012, this straight six that's in it and the Marmon Wasp six-cylinder were the only six-cylinder engines to win the 500, and obviously since the new regulations it's been blown out of the water.
So through the early 50s we got a very contemporary looking Indy car, and that was this upright dirt style car. Johnny Parsons winning in 1950, the winning car of Lee Wallard in 1951. I'll eventually get it. And of course 1952 Troy Ruttman, and of course I forget the 1951 winner, but that was a very important one to our current owner of the racetrack, Roger Penske. Tell us a little bit about these upright dirt cars and how special they were in their time.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the late 40s, obviously you had these low-slung Blue Crowns and Novis, but a lot of these cars were these upright dirt cars because the 500 was the only paved track on the surface at that time on the circuit. But Frank Curtis designing two of these three cars here with the wind's friction proof, and then this Curtis here. Obviously, 51 is a very important historical year, not only for the dominance of this car in the season by Tony Bettenhausen, but then Lee Wallard winning the race, which is a unique story and kind of that tragedy of the Bettenhausen family here at the Speedway. But little did anyone know, a young Roger Penske, as a child, along with his father, attended the race. This was the first race that he attended and started this path to what eventually now is 19 victories and owning the place.
And of course, Troy Ruttman still, despite the fact that we have teenagers almost every year participating in the 500, still the youngest winner at 22 years old.
Yeah, this car is unique. That record, it's astounding to your point of how young drivers are. And Ruttman, who was just under 23 years old, winning it. And the Kuzma built car that this is, it's unique. It has good lines. But another legacy. This was the first of what became three for a family legacy of the Agajanian. J.C. Agajanian in this car, he would go on and win with Parnelli that we'll talk about later. But then the legacy of the family, the 2011 and 2016, both carried that 98, which was Agajanian's number, and still had the Agajanian pig mascot on all those cars.
Yeah, it's amazing. The only 4 wins for number 98 have all been Agajanian associated cars. 1953 and 54, Bill Vukovich, and to me, Bill Vukovich, I don't think people talk about him enough because I think he is probably, if not the greatest, he's top 5 all time at the Indianapolis 500. I mean, he could have won every single race he entered here, and that you cannot say about hardly any drivers.
Just the dominance that he had, and to echo a lot of your points there, I mean, he had a great car in 52, obviously 53, 54 would win with this Roadster, another Frank Curtis built car, and really bringing the Roadster style car. We talked about the Cummins diesel, but obviously when the Roadster was debuted, really coined the name Roadster. When he first saw this type of car, he quipped that looks like his old Roadster hot rod that he had with how low and the no top on it. But unfortunately lost his life in that 55 race. But to your point, if there is a Mount Rushmore of IndyCar greats at Indianapolis, Vukovich is definitely on there. It's a hard list to make, but...
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, with 4 four-time winners, I mean, who's number 5? It's probably Bill Vukovich, if not a little bit higher on that list. You mentioned the 55 race, tragic because of the loss of Bill Vukovich while leading that race. This car adopted by Bob Jenkins, the late, great Bob Jenkins. And this car so famous because it was the pink zinc. Pink cars now a little bit more common than they were back then, but everybody has a soft spot for that one. And of course, the 57 and 58 car, which I think is one of the most beautiful cars of all time.
Yeah, I obviously you mentioned our Adopt a Car program that we're continuing to do as we close, and Bob adopted this car during his life, and then his family have continued that legacy. As I believe was one of the first races, if not his first race that he went to, and remembers this car. The John Zink family would win in 55 and 56 with Pat Flaherty, and then be one of the powerhouse teams in the 50s. But a chief mechanic on this car was A.J. Watson, and he would go on and whether it was his car that he campaigned himself or a car that he made for a customer, would really dominate that late 50, early 60s roadster period, and started through the 50s, but his first win as chief mechanic in 55. And then the Ballon car, it's to your point, one of the more striking cars. George Sallee, the car owner at the time, builder, didn't want to enter it in the 500. He wanted to actually sell it. Didn't have any bidders for it, so entered it, and then would win with Sam Hanks, who would go on and retire in Victory Lane. And then the following year, Jimmy Bryant would go on and win, becoming the only car to win back-to-back 500s with two separate drivers.
Yeah, and Sam Hanks not only loved his cigars, but also kind of cool with him is that the connection to the modern era is that it took him the same amount of 500s as Tony Kanaan and Joseph Newgarden took to win their first Indianapolis 500s. Puts it in a bit of perspective, but of course careers not only were shorter back then, but drivers started later. Mm-hmm. So in some ways the Sam Hanks win is perhaps the most impressive of the three, but it's amazing.
Another point too that I mentioned earlier, how they laid the offie down.
Yes.
In the configuration really lowered the center of gravity of the car, and then you would eventually kind of see copies of this car made by Quinn Epperly and a few others in this kind of configuration, which is drastically lower than a typical roadster of the time.
You mentioned the Watson name, and the Watson Roadster and Watson equivalent, maybe built to the same specification cars, dominated the Indianapolis 500 in the early 1960s. You've got Jim Rathman in 1960, A.J. Foyt in 1961. Roger Ward won in a Roadster in 59 and 62. Yep. Parnelli Jones and Old Calhoun, and of course the 64 winner with A.J. Foyt once again. Such a special era of the Indianapolis 500, and my grandfather would probably say it was the last few years of true romance at the Speedway.
Yeah, I mean, you look at this, and a few years ago we did an exhibit called Roadsters to Records that highlighted 60 to 72. In those 12 years, you'll never see the advancement of technology, innovation, just change here at the Speedway, not only in the cars themselves, but the total package of the Speedway in popular culture, fan attendance too at the time just boomed. But you look at the Rathman car and you think about the battle between Jim Rathman and Roger Ward, at that time the defending winner, which would hold the record until I believe 2012. Yep. For most passes for the lead. Now that's been blown out of the water with the current configuration and driving styles. But then the 60s and 70s really started that modern hero legend aspect, and A.J. Foyt obviously is one of the leaders of that pack, winning in 61 with this Trevis built car. It looks like a Watson, but it's actually a separate. Floyd Trevis was the designer and builder of this. But the battle between Eddie Sachs and Foyt in those last few laps, where it looked like because of a fueling issue, Foyt handed the win to Sachs, and then the tire issue with Sachs giving the lead back to Foyt and going on to win. The other thing too to keep in mind with this car, the majority of the front straightaway was still exposed brick when A.J. Foyt won, about 750 yards of it, which then was repaved that following autumn. 62, Roger Ward in the leader card roadster there. Another Watson, obviously A.J. Watson on that car, his connection with the leader card team throughout the years. But, he was battling cars that he was building, The other, going to Parnelli Jones, this is another iconic. These next two cars are very iconic Watson Roadsters, but Parnelli breaking 150 in 1962 and following it up with the victory in 1963 and battling A.J. Foyt in 64 until the fire really ended his day at that time. But we talked about Agajanian, and this carries not only the 98, that number, the Agajanian pig, as they were connected with the trash business in Southern California, but just the fact that you really had these cars were tough. They were fast, high horsepower for their time, low weight, and you really had to muscle these cars around for 3+4 hours in the conditions. And then finally, one of my favorite cars here, the 1964 Watson, that A.J. Foyt would win his second 500 with. What's special about this car is the fact that it still contains its patina from its final race, late 1964. It hasn't been restored. Unlike a lot of these cars, at some point they were restored. This one contains all the pop marks and markings and has aged with that patina, which gives it that connection to Foyt in a way. And another interesting point with this car is for hot rod fans out there, there's a gentleman named Dean Jeffries that was a painter in Southern California. He did a lot of hot rod, kind of crazy paint work for hot rods, but he was the painter on this. And now it's starting to kind of yellow because of age. But at the time, with this pearlescent white, they had an issue of the paint yellowing at the time in the period. And Jeffries kind of found that solution by putting a little acetane in the paint, nail polish remover, if you will, and really helped keep that pearlescent look of the car. But just spectacular in the fact that it's a survivor.
Well, and you mentioned the iconic nature of the Parnelli car and the AJ car. I think a big reason why these cars are so iconic is because they did battle with the rear-engine cars, the rear-engine revolution, which, believe it or not, IndyCar fans have always been a little bit resistant to change. That's been a consistent, non-changing thing, but eventually things did have to change, and we've got a great example of this right here with AJ's 64 winner, his second win, and his third winner, his Coyote, which is, I think, still based on a Lotus, if I'm not mistaken. But, I mean, the difference is absolutely striking.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Foyt's the only driver to win with both the front and rear engine car, but, you look at drivers of the era, there was a lot of them out there. Gordon Johncock is one of them that made that jump. The list is too numerous, obviously. Mario, too. Mario did run a roadster at one point in his career a few times. Bobby with the Novice in the early 60s. But, that change, it just had to be magical to watch the cars and how the rear engines, because of the success, gained the footing and became more popular, because there was some hesitation, especially in 63, 64 on jumping that ship. And actually going back to 64, both Parnelli and Foyt had a rear engine Lotus 34 that was similar to Clark's pole car of the time. But they, even though they did some testing in that, Foyt in a Huffaker 2 went to their tried and true roadsters, and then obviously that battle and Foyt becoming the last front engine car to win.
I wonder how much effect looking at the 1968 car. We talked about the turbines, which to me, you heard me. I wax poetic about how much I love those cars. But much like the rear-engine cars, the turbines were hated, and it's kind of funny that fans that maybe were cheering against rear-engine cars just a couple of years earlier were definitely cheering for Bobby Unser when he won in 1968 over those quiet, silent Sams.
They were a house divided, if you will. I mean, people were opinionated at the time, and.
Wait, people were opinionated around here?
Yeah. We have in the collection from after the 67 race to all the ticket holders. Tony Holman and IMS sent out a index card that had prompts on it asking people what their thoughts were for the turbine cars, that they should race here, comments. So there was, I won't say a democratic way, but there was a attempt to reach out and get people so we can go through there and see the gauntlet of, yes, innovation at Indy is needed. You can't let those cars in the track. But 68, the battle between Joe Leonard and Bobby Unser, really went back and forth throughout the race. Bobby loved to tell the story of him passing Leonard after he suffered his issues on lap 192 and sailing by him to go on to win. And really started that dynasty of the Unsers that we'll talk about a little bit later at Indy with this Eagle here.
And of course, the team that he beat running those such revolutionary cars at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, always trying to push the technology. Even in 1969, they showed up with a rear-wheel drive or a four-wheel drive Lotus, but ultimately Mario crashed that car, and his teammates decided they didn't want to drive that car. So we end up with the Bronner Hawk and the only, to date, Andretti driver to win at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Yeah, so this car, the real car, if you will, is now, I believe, on display at the Smithsonian. They just did a new exhibition and put it on display, and this is a secondary chassis that they used, and we call it a replica, but it was a true car. But yeah, it's 69 is pretty amazing after 2 years of being so close and yet losing with the turbines. Granatelli went to the piston-powered quad cam Ford with that Lotus Type 64, which was a pretty high-tech car, but obviously suffered the issue. Mario made it out somewhat unscathed. He did suffer the burns on his face, and Aldo filled in for the front row photo, which has come out over the years. And really, this was at that time about a 2-year-old car, and they had their dramas throughout the race. They suffered with overheating. The rear tire they couldn't get off, so they ran the entire rate 500 miles with really just changing the 3 tires. And even though Mario would go and lead by pretty much 2 laps over Dan Gurney, it wasn't a walk in the park for him, because at any second the car could have crashed or fallen out due to the overheating issue. Yeah,
I think they actually mounted an oil cooler outside of the race car, and then USAC told them, no, you can't do that, so they hid it under the seat. Yeah. And I'm sure that was a warm ride for Mario throughout the 500. But then again, I guess he was already burned, so it was all right. We talked about Parnelli Jones quite a bit. We've talked about the VPJ team and these 2 cars, the Johnny Lightnings. I mean, if it's not the Jim Clark Lotus, you hear men of a certain age, men and women of a certain age, talk about the Johnny Lightning cars and how that was their introduction to IndyCar racing. And you really can't pick 2 more beautiful cars to display in this museum.
I mean, it is fascinating to see that. We talked about Mount Rushmore of drivers. I think Mount Rushmore of livery, these cars definitely would be on it, along with probably the Marlboro cars and maybe the Wasp, because that's just how iconic it was at the time. But Al with Parnelli VPJ team, pretty amazing when you think of just the dominance that he had in 1970. I think the only time he did not lead was when he gave the lead away due to pit stops, and then in '71 had a little bit more of a challenge from the McLaren team. They had that engine cover that really was a wing, which kind of skirted the USAC rules at the time, but unfortunately for the McLaren team and the Penske team at the time, suffered issues during the race, and Al was there to capitalize, becoming the first back-to-back winner since Vukovic. And a lot of people thought that it was the same car, but obviously, as you can tell here, there's slight differences, but they are 2 separate cars, and kind of not a copy, but a lot of kind of Lola at the time emphasis on design.
Well, that was part of the reason they moved away from this car, was because the Lola was a 4-wheel drive car, right? And they banned 4-wheel drive after '69. Yep. So they had to build something new, but they liked the Lola, so they stuck with it. Al Unser Sr., of course, the last driver until Helio Castroneves to win back-to-back Indianapolis 500s. That was something that I remember. 2002 was my first 500, and so many people would always write off the previous winner because it was so unlikely that was going to happen again. And as we've seen now, Helio's kind of becoming that guy that people are shooting for and just can't seem to knock off. Marcus Ericsson came close this year.
Yeah, and when you think about in '72, because of some penalties, Al was credited to second place, and I think he was the closest ever to get close to that 3 in a row finishing position, and Elio did the same thing in 2003, and then obviously with Marcus almost going back-to-back this year.
You mentioned the McLarens. In 1972, IndyCar racing changed into, I think, what you and I both kind of consider to be the modern era, where you have outboard wings that are not an integral part of the body. and this 1972 McLaren M16 run by the Roger Penske team. I mean, how appropriate that Roger Penske's first win is the first one with wings as we kind of know them today. What a special car this one is.
Yeah, this car, not only is it just proportion right, and I mentioned the McLaren team in 71 showing up with that wing, if you will, but had that engine cover that went from the back of the tub to the wing, so they claim that it was a part of the bodywork, which that's how it's skated around the rules at the time. 72, USAC allowed bolt-on aerodynamic devices, which then would go on to lead Mark to the victory. But really, we talked about Bedhausen earlier.
Yep.
Gary in the sister car, team car, really dominated that race and looked like it was going to be his day for once, but unfortunately suffered mechanical issues later in the race, and then Mark was there to capitalize on that. But you know, these cars, whether it's the Eagle counterpart, just fast, high downforce at the time with that large wing, about 1,000 horsepower in the race. Offenhauser turbocharged. That was developing in the 60s with the quad cam and the turbocharged Offies, but just really fast cars and good looking car here.
Yeah, the pole speed from 1971 to 1972 jumped 15 miles an hour. They almost cracked the 200. Yeah, so they almost cracked the 200 mile an hour barrier when they were running 186, and that was fast the previous year. We'll never see speeds jump like that again. AJ Foyt's fourth win, one of the most special cars and special stories of all time. Not only did AJ win I mean, that's special enough, but he did it driving for his own team, driving his own chassis with his own engine in the back of it. I mean, that is, you want to talk about a walk-off home run? I mean, how can you get any better than that for AJ?
You know, these cars are unique because in some configuration, AJ debuted this version of the Coyote all the way back in 1973 and then modified it over the years to moving some radiators and things like that around. But yeah, obviously, since his win in 1967, he was always, can AJ do four? Can AJ do four? And then 10 years later would win with this car. But obviously, Gordy had a pretty strong race that year. And it wasn't it wasn't his to lose, if you will. So he had the competitors. But I think another kind of interesting point about this, and we talked about Roger, you know, I believe 77 was Doug Bull's first 500.
Oh, wow.
He talks about that being I think he was 10 years old and really starting his path to his career in the 500. But just a great opportunity, great car, great story. And then AJ would run these type of cars until 79, which then he switched to a VPJ chassis and finished second behind Mears in that car. Yeah,
in 77, definitely the winds of change were blowing. Last race for Tony Holman, the last race for Sid Collins, the first race for a female driver, Janet Guthrie. So really, you want to talk about a significant race? 77 is pretty damn significant.
The year prior, speaking of Janet, and we talked about her earlier in the other video, but when she was struggling with the Lightning in 76, AJ put her in his backup Coyote.
Yes.
And she did run laps that were to be competitive, but he claimed at the time he didn't want to enter another car. So unfortunately, she didn't have that opportunity. But Janet did run a Coyote chassis for a bit in practice during the 500.
Yep, and proved that she could do it. And certainly with the top 10 finish we saw in the previous video, she was definitely a capable driver. Let's talk about Jim Hall, because I think these two cars we can knock out at the same time, because it shows a dramatic, probably the real final innovation we've seen in IndyCar racing up until this point, and that is ground effects. We have a car, a Lola from 1978, which Al Unser Sr. won in, and then the Johnny Rutherford car from 1980. And what is the big difference between these two machines, Jason?
Well, I think the biggest one is the ground effects that were developed with the Chaparral here. But obviously you can see the skirts. It's still a flat bottom car, but they were kind of playing around with it with that Lola there. But really this Chaparral has those tunnels in that domination. And Al has a connection to both of these two. Winning in 78 with the Lola there, it's interesting. Al always said that he won the Triple Crown, which was Indianapolis, the 3 500-mile races, Indianapolis, Ontario, and Michigan. And even though he had that success, Al always said this car tried to kill him every time he got behind the wheel.
Really?
Even though it had that success, Al wasn't too fond of that vehicle in itself. But then in '79, when the Chaparral was introduced, Al was behind the wheel and was dominating the '79 race until I believe it was a transmission failure that put him out, or he dropped an oil issue that put him out of the race. And then the following year, Johnny Rutherford hopped in the car and got his third Indianapolis 500 win after winning with McLaren his previous two attempts, wins with McLaren.
Yeah, and I think, again, when we talk about upper echelon, as Luke is showing us the tunnels underneath the car, certainly bigger Venturi tunnels than we're used to these days. I mean, these cars produced so much downforce, but unfortunately, there were some times where there's some accidents where you would lose control and the car would hook, and it would really be a devastating accident. So they had to make those tunnels smaller just for a safety issue.
And the skirts were movable, if you will. They could move up and down, and then they made them affixed later on to try to combat that. You know, the '72 car is probably the first year that Indy cars look like what we know Indy cars with the wing, but really '79, '78, the Chaparral here for Indy car racing is kind of the initial modern Indy car design that they would tinker and tweak and things like that. It's just very, very high tech for its time, and John Bernard building this car, it was fantastic.
You mentioned the modern look of an Indy car, but the modern look of an Indy car race perhaps we can trace to 1982. Until that time that 1982 happened and Gordon Johncock won over Rick Mears, the closest 500 was, I believe, 1937, and it was about a second and a half, and that was considered a close finish. Johncock and Mears was a little closer than that.
It's interesting because that everyone remembers that finish, and they remember Paul Page or Bob Jenkins on the radio making that call that no one saw. I mean, you watch the race and you just hear the excitement growing, and Mears really got himself in that. It was hung up in the pits and really gave the opportunity to Johncock and them going into turn one, and Johncock really, I won't say shut the door, but he did all he could to make Mears pass him, and then Mears getting the run and almost passing him before the line. But you know what's interesting with this year's 500 victory, in that margin of victory, this isn't even in the top five anymore, which is amazing when you think of all the close finishes we've had within the last 10 years with obviously 92, but then now with the Newgarden finish, with Will Powers finish, I believe Ryan Hunter-Reay's is up there now, all ahead of this margin of victory here.
Also the last American-designed and built car to win the Indianapolis 500, and that is due in part because of this machine next to it, the March. We continue to talk about the progression of IndyCar racing. In some ways, for us tech geeks and people who like the machinery, we're probably cursing the March company just a little bit, because this was really the beginning of the standardization of IndyCar racing. If you wanted to win for several years, you needed a March with a Cosworth.
March with a Cosworth, and then later a Lola, and it kind of bounced back and forth. And then, really that, I don't want to say it's mass-produced, but the fact that you could buy from a customer a kind of prepackaged car and be fast and have that Cosworth engine. Tom winning in '83 was amazing, but you got to look at his whole career and him breaking the 200-mile-an-hour barrier in 1976 with the, or 77.
That's another significant 77 moment
with the McLaren and Penske. But then a car that we don't have on display right now, but part of the collection is actually the following year 84 C that Sneva broke 210 here at the Speedway. So it's neat to have both of those. Obviously, the 83 car is typically on display as the winner, but it's a neat option.
Yeah, I think in that 1984 race, I think March consisted of 30 of the 33 starters, and until the Dallara era, that was the most that any one chassis kind of dominated the race. Tom Sneva on the gas man. The 90s, I'm pretty partial to this era. I like the 90s a little bit, as you guys might know from my content, but The Domino's Pizza Hot One, I always think this is fun because the number 30 was for 30 minutes or less, the guarantee that ultimately caused Domino's Pizza a bit of legal trouble.
Yep.
Probably why the sponsorship went away, unfortunately. Race cars weren't such a good look, but you talked about the Lola company. Ironically enough, despite the fact that they had so much dominance in the marketplace, only 3 Lola wins, I believe. One in the 60s, one in the 70s, and one in the 90s, and that's it for the company. It's kind of amazing to think about that they weren't as dominant despite the fact of how many cars they seem to sell every year.
Yeah, it's this car's special in a lot of ways. I think the livery is unique, and the fact that I think everyone here in the States most likely has had a slice of Domino's pizza at some point in their life. But Ari with this car would go on and set the fastest 500 at the time, and held it up until I believe 2013. When he was surpassed, and now that has been kind of blown out of the water with Elio's 2021 average time. But it's a sleek car. It's one of the lower ones. I think the Porsche counterpart is a little bit lower than this. But through the mid '80s, you started seeing more carbon fiber being added to the cars. Obviously, the March that we talked about a little bit earlier started that. But by the early '90s, especially. The full carbon cars that we know today were starting to become in vogue a few years after this. But
yeah, I should also mention that Porsche is also in the museum collection, and you can see how just tight the cockpit confines got. In fact, A.J. Foyt had a Lola in 1990 and actually had to special order one to fit in the race car. And A.J. was not, everybody kind of makes fun of A.J. or whatever, and A.J.'s really not that big of a guy if you think about it, and that just tells you how tiny the cockpit confines are. I mean, you guys have hard times finding people that sit in this car when you need to push it around.
Yeah, that too, and we do not have it actually left to go on to display, but I know Bobby's Rahall's 86 March, he always said he'd have to cut down the seat and almost be sitting on the tub because of his height. So that's a big difference now. Even someone like Stephen Wilson or Justin or Graham Rahal can fit in these modern cars, even though they are 6'3", 4" in that area. Very tall for a race car driver.
You mentioned that 86 Budweiser March. Unfortunately, not on display right now. It's heading to the Concours d'Excellence, so it's a very beautiful car. But I think it's something that's important to mention, although it's not here. Until very recently, that's the most recent car that was added to the collection, and winning car that was added to the collection. And the most recent one before that was this car from 1995, Jacques Villeneuve's Reynard.
Yeah. So the Bob Dylan song, "The Times They Are Changing," 95, 96, 94. All that, that's really where this car comes in, and similar to the Ari car that in the last video, I think it's probably best for you to take the lead on these next 2 cars that we have.
Well, okay, Jacques Villeneuve in 1995 was coming off a very impressive rookie run where he was second. A lot of people would call him first in class behind the Mercedes-Benz of Al Unser Jr. and Emerson Fittipaldi, who crashed while having lapped Al Jr. even. But Jacques Villeneuve came from 2 laps behind. There's some question of whether he actually made it up on track or whether he got waved around. Regardless, he ran 505 miles, whether it was under green or whether it wasn't, to get up behind Scott Goodyear, who was leading the race towards the later stages, had a few challenges from Jimmy Vasser and Scott Pruitt. Both of them crashed. But then on the last restart from the Pruitt crash, Goodyear passed the pace car. There's some debate of whether the pace car was going fast enough or not going fast enough. We'll leave that to the viewers to debate in the comments. But ultimately, the win was handed to Jacques Villeneuve, despite the fact that Scott Goodyear did cross the line first, but was stopped scoring after a couple of laps of black flag action. And Jacques Villeneuve, of course, would go on to win the Formula One World Championship the next year and would actually return. A lot of people forget this. He came back in 2014 and ran a one-off race for Sam Schmidt. Wasn't super impressive, and I think that's why a lot of people kind of forget that he did that. But he also is one of the few drivers to run in the Formula One, the Indy 500, and the Brickyard 400. Not many people. I think Juan Pablo Montoya might be the only other one to do that. So pretty neat stuff. And, of course, I'll talk about this car.
Yeah.
I'll let Jason, I'll let you start a little bit.
I will preference, we talked about cars that are on loan to the museum, and this is one of those winning cars that has been on quasi-permanent loan over the last few years, because it has been on display really since 2017, and then before that from various times. So we really appreciate Ron Himmelgarn's generosity and look forward to bringing this back to the museum once we reopen. But if there's anyone to talk about Buddy Lazier, it would be David Land.
Yeah, well, Ron Himmelgarn, first of all, has an excellent collection of cars. I've been meaning to get up to Toledo to see his big collection of cars that he has up there, including the Eagle Aircraft Special. But this car is very special to me. This is, if you ever wonder what to blame for David Land existing, and especially for the purple color, it's this car. Obviously, 1996, a very tumultuous time in Indy car racing. This was the split. The US 500 happened the same day, won by Jimmy Vasser. With the kart drivers and teams, but Buddy Lazier had a very interesting 1996. He broke his back in a savage crash at Phoenix. Not many people would be able to come back from that, certainly in 2 months, to start practicing for the Indianapolis 500. But Buddy was able to get here, qualified a reasonable fifth. They really didn't push the car very much throughout the month. They were just kind of hanging back. I think they kind of knew what they had. And as you know, guys like Ari fell out of the race, Buddy was in position, and with about 8 laps to go, Davy Jones was leading the race, and it actually had a little bit of contact with Eliseo Salazar on a restart. Buddy passed Alessandro Zampedri for second, and then Davy Jones within the last 10 laps took the lead and never looked back. And to win it with a broken back was a pretty spectacular. Athletic feat, if anything. I mean, and unfortunately, because it was the split, this win kind of gets glossed over and overlooked, and I understand that. Like, I'm not going to pretend like, I'm not going to pretend like there weren't a lot of drivers and teams who probably should have been here competing, but at the same time, to win the race and to be credited with winning the race, you had to be here. And Buddy Lazier was here, and he was the best of that day. And frankly, you look at his record, even when the kart teams came back, he was still competitive. So definitely a deserving winner, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you watch that race in hindsight, and you do see that kind of reeling Davy Jones in, and Davy was great. This last summer, fall area, about a year ago, we opened our exhibition titled Second, so we actually had the Davy Jones car here as part of that exhibit, and he was great. He loaned us his variety of different suits and things like that. I know I'm getting more into Davy here, but what's interesting is, a few weeks later, Davy would win outright Le Mans, and is the final American to win Le Mans. So Davy could have, would have, should have been the only driver to win both the Indianapolis 500 and the 24 Hours of Le Mans, only a few weeks apart.
Also, the final thing I want to say about especially these two cars, but also including the Ari car, it's always interesting to me because we talk about Lola, we talk about March, but for the fact that they only participated in 3 Indianapolis 500s, the Reynard Company, or Renard, however you want to say it, had an incredibly important role to play. Not only did they win in 95, they won in 96, but they have the track record and still hold the track record despite the company being defunct since 2000. It's kind of strange to think about, with the split, such a car company that doesn't even exist anymore could have had such a more prolific run here at the Speedway, but ultimately history only shows 2 wins and of course that track record. But some of the best looking cars of all time, I think. And finally, I guess, we've seen and will continue to see, I believe, the Alexander Rossi 2016 winner here in the museum, but that car's already gone home for rest for 18 months. But I mean, what else can you say about Dan Weldon? I think kind of the modern equivalent to Bill Vukovich in a lot of ways, a driver who was so strong here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and tragically his career and his life cut short. But I'll tell you, I'm not here every day like you are, but I have a strong suspicion that this is one of the more popular cars around this floor.
Oh, for sure. We have the honor of having a variety of different drivers who were the driver or one of the most popular drivers of their era, and Weldon is that. And we're fortunate that this car has been on loan since 2012 to us, and we're working. It will go back to its owner, but then we're working to have it back here in April of 2025 when we reopen. But not only was that race, the 100th anniversary, so special in itself, the race itself was dramatic for a variety of different reasons. The fact that a lot of teams were gambling and trying to squeak out that fuel mileage, and we're just kind of dropping like flies on those last 20 laps, and Weldon making that, not only with that situation, but making passes on the track to get himself in contention. But obviously with Hildebrand and the issue coming out of 4, going too high and getting into the marbles and hitting the wall, I think by the time Weldon was like in 3rd or something going into turn 3, and then put himself in contention. And one of my favorite kind of factoids, if you will, about this race, back when we did our 1956 exhibition, we talked about Joe Dawson and how he led pretty much 4 laps, and at the time was the least driver to win the race, leading the least amount of distance. 99 years later, Weldon took that record, if you will, by leading only in that couple hundred yards of the finish. And unless someone, there's a photo finish with someone who didn't lead the entire race except at the line, I don't see that record ever being broken.
Yeah, and just from a historical perspective of this car, you talked about the era in which you needed a March Cosworth. Well, this really kind of represents, at least for now, in terms of chassis competition, where that kind of died out, because the Dallara was better than the contemporary Panos chassis, and even at this point, you didn't even have an engine choice. It was all Hondas, all Dallaras, but this is certainly, it's amazing to think about this car, because, now we're getting into eras where I definitely remember where I was sitting, how I reacted. I think I even filmed my reaction to this finish and uploaded it to my YouTube channel. And now we're standing here, and it's a museum piece. And and unfortunately, for the next 18 months, we're not going to be able to experience this. So it's really neat to be able to do this and see all these cars and see this museum as it is. But let's go someplace where most of the public hasn't been able to go for a little while. The infamous basement. It's not as exciting as it used to be, unfortunately, but it's about to be. And we'll talk about a little bit the renovations that are going to be happening here at the museum. Yeah. All right, Jason, we're about to take a ride that has been off limits for a whole lot of people over the years. I know a lot of people want to take this ride, but unfortunately, we haven't been able to do it just yet. But as the museum changes and the renovations begin to happen, what's a really special thing about this is the basement's going to be open to the public for the first time ever, and I think that's going to be really cool. You're using all the space now.
Yeah, we're really excited because we are utilizing the basement to be a public offering and expand our exhibition and display and vehicles on display.
So let's take a look at this, because, this used to be, I had the privilege, and I still am pinching myself that you guys let me come down here into the basement. But this place was so special for so long and so freaky. And it's a little bit more freaky now because it's so empty. And
so we're kind of walking to the abyss here, and walking in here, there's a little bit of vaults that you may have seen that held the non-vehicle items, but really there's a few items in here right now that we're still moving out toward our golf carts that we do tours. But this is the legendary basement, and a few weeks ago we were able to take IMS on their YouTube series through here, so we did let people see kind of a last look. But I think this is a view, take out a few of the other miscellaneous stuff that you haven't seen or someone hasn't seen unless they were here before the museum opened in 76. It's completely empty. We have construction equipment from our partners at Shield Sexton kind of staging over there. It is amazing to think we're only, while we're recording this, a few days away from closing the museum, but starting November 6th, we'll be closed to the public, start that construction. And this will be public area, which will have rotating exhibition gallery, additional winners on the lower level, featured car gallery, and we'll actually run the tours out of here too. But it's kind of surreal to think. It's been a long time coming, and by no means are we to the finish line. We have an 18-month-long construction period, which we will continue to do tours, so keep in mind you can take a lap around the track while the museum's closed. We're just going to be running out of a satellite location next door, so there is that opportunity to come see the track late after we close the museum. But one of the biggest things right now is we're still fundraising for this project. As right now we're about 50% there, majority of the way of the museum portion of that $89 million total goal that we're raising. So $64 million will go to the building itself here, the renovations that we're beginning. 15 of that additional will go to an off-site 60,000 square foot restoration and storage location that also will be open to the public. It'll be off-site. And then the final 10 million is for an endowment. And what's really special is really you can, by giving that tax deductible gift, you can truly become a part and supporter of the museum and make this reimagination and dream a reality, and really not have that opportunity in the history of IMS when you think about it.
Yeah. Well, you know, Jason, I'm so grateful for all the things that you've been able to do for me and this museum, you know, even before, you know, you and I were friends or we started working together, both my channel and the museum to help try to promote the sport. I think that, you know, this museum is so special and so important that I really hope that folks get behind this, because I think it is a good thing. For Indy car racing, for the museum, for the Indianapolis 500, it's really going to be neat, and I think it's something that's needed. And I'll say this, I guess we should leave on this. You know, Jason, you know, you hate when I bring this up, but you are the curator of the IMS museum. Your perspective is historically important. You know, this is a new museum coming, essentially, from the inside almost out, not all the way out, but you know, how are you feeling and what is your perspective on this? Because this is a significant moment in Indianapolis Motor Speedway history.
Yeah, when you think about, we talked about the beginning of the museum in a different location in 1956 and the way to honor Wilbur Shaw of his untimely passing and the desire of Tony Holman and Carl Kaiser to tell the stories of IMS. You fast forward almost 70 years later, you know, you really do not get an opportunity to take an institution this historic and, you know, for a lot of people, they're connected to it, and move it into the future so we can better tell the stories of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, better display the items on display, cars and non-vehicles, and add it in a modern way that we can truly tell those stories on par with what our friends over at IMS are doing with the Indianapolis 500 and other, you know, world-class events that they put on here. So I think it's going to not only elevate the museum in a modern sense, it's going to add a public entity and institution here on site on the west side of Indianapolis. And you know, really, we cannot do this without the support of the variety of different members, donors, and supporters that we have gathered and will gather through any sort of contribution. So whether it's you know, $5 or you know, $10 million or something like that. That's a wide range, but truly every single donation, no matter what that monetary value is, allows us to get to there. And obviously you could find more information on our project and how to donate on our website, imsmuseum.org.
And there should be a link in the description of all three videos. Jason, this has been an absolute pleasure. We're sad to see a little bit of history go, but we're excited to make some new history, I think, here at the IMS Museum. So thank you guys all so much for watching, and again, thanks for Jason for giving his time. And you know, for someone like me who loves this sport and loves the 500 especially, it's so much fun to be able to talk about the history, and I hope that you guys at home have enjoyed it. So. For 18 months, we're not going to be able to stand here, but Jason, I'll tell you what, I'm looking forward to standing here with you in the renovation, and hopefully we'll go through that too and take a look at it when it's ready to go.
Well, it'll be here before you know it.
Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.